What would you do if the person you trusted most destroyed your family from within? This is not just a story about betrayal. It's about the painful choice between staying in a broken marriage or walking away to save yourself and your children. In today's video on Cheating Stories 7, you'll hear how one man uncovered his wife's long-hidden affair and realized that divorce was not revenge. It was survival. Stay until the end, because the twist will leave you questioning what you would do in his place. So, let's dive into this gripping story. My wife's affair shattered our family. Divorce was my only choice. The silence became its own kind of truth. For 7 months, I shared a bed with a woman who still knew my grocery list and my alarm tone, but she no longer knew my thoughts. The house still moved through its choreography, coffee set on a timer, the wind chime grazing the window, 2 mugs turned upside down on the rack like habits that refused to die. In photographs, nothing cracked. Yet in sound, the hum was gone. Small gaps replaced old jokes. Pauses swallowed glances that once spoke entire paragraphs. That is how endings arrive, quietly until quiet is all you hear. Lauren's phone learned to sleep face down. Her returns grew later, draped in explanations that fit too neatly. A perfume we did not own tried to move in. The upstairs office earned a lock. I did not explode. I archived instead. Phone bills, odd charges, screenshots, evidence that filled a folder on the top shelf labeled post-separation, as if naming the cliff might make the fall polite. Running came back to me because dread travels lighter when your lungs carry some of it. Frozen air taught my breath to form small visible truths, and I practiced the sentences every parent dreads to practice. We both love you. This is not your fault. Sometimes grown-ups cannot live in the same house. I whispered them into the empty kitchen until the words stopped shaking. The children sensed the weather before the storm. My son asked why I looked tired. My daughter asked why Mommy's phone always hid its face. I gave careful answers that bought a day without selling a lie. At work, I turned myself into a metronome, steady, predictable, so the roof over them would not learn our secret too early. A pet store handed me an unexpected mercy. I was buying dog food when I saw Elena at the same shelf, her hand reaching for the same brand. She laughed, and I remembered it too well. We had been friends once, the almost kind that ended with good night. She read more than my face. I told her I was married, that I would not borrow light from a future I had not earned. She wrote her number on the receipt and told me to call only when calling would not be a betrayal. I kept that receipt like a match I refused to strike. That night smelled of citrus, cleaner, and decision. I set 2 mugs on the rack because habits break last. The wind chime tapped twice, then stilled. Whiskey gave scaffolding to the words I had to lift. When Lauren's key turned in the lock, the room held its breath. She found me at the table, papers stacked too neatly to look casual. I asked her to sit. The practice speech waited in my throat, but I chose fewer, plainer words. I told her I had known for months. I told her I would not live as the custodian of a secret that was never mine to keep. I told her I wanted oxygen, the kind only truth can buy. And then I said divorce. Not as a weapon, but as a surface. I expected numbers, the quick relief of someone already elsewhere. I expected a performance of anger. What came instead was sound. Not tears at first, but a low, broken noise I had never heard from the woman who once knew my coffee order by heart. Her hands shook water from a glass. She reached for my fingers, then stopped halfway as if touch might undo a verdict. She tried the familiar script. It meant nothing. It is over. We can fix this. She offered counseling, passwords, a life lived under inspection. I listened like a paramedic, kind, efficient, unwilling to promise. Secrets become a third person in a house too small for 3 adults. The children deserved a story that could survive daylight. When language failed, silence told the truth. We would talk custody in the morning. We would remain civil, even kind, because the children copy what they see. I would take the couch. She folded into herself and cried in a key that made the room cold. After midnight, I returned the papers to their shelf. The dog shadowed me like a witness with no words. I washed the mugs and set them upside down. My phone lay on the counter with the receipt beneath it. a white flag I was not ready to raise. I stood in the doorway of the children's room, watching my son sleep with his arms thrown back like surrender. I whispered into the dark, "We both love you. Some lines deserve rehearsal before they meet daylight." By morning, I would write terms. Ambiguity is how people drown. Tonight, the house carried what I had finally said out loud. I had not won nor lost anything I had not been losing for months. I had simply chosen air. And just before sleep found me on the couch, I understood why the hum had gone. It had been making room for the siren. The night did not end with silence alone. It bled into the early hours where the sound of Lauren's sobs grew heavier, not staged, but raw, like a body remembering how to break. Her shoulders hunched as if something enormous was folding her in half. When she slid a binder across the table, I saw the neatness of it before I saw the chaos inside. Tabs in color, bullet points, timelines, hotel names. A confession dressed like an accountant's report. She whispered that it was over, that she had blocked him, that she had been reckless and lonely, but never meant to destroy the family. I kept my chair steady, my breath measured. Inside my chest was a drawer full of knives. I listened, but I did not reach for her hands. Each page she offered was another form of currency, her attempt to purchase forgiveness. Research for counseling sessions, addresses of new churches she would attend, passwords scribbled on sticky notes, even the promise of a baby, as if new life could paste over cracked foundations. I told her quietly that there is no marketplace where confession buys back trust. Secrets rot a house from the inside, and ours had already been hollowed. She shook her head furiously, insisting she never thought I would find out that nobody was supposed to be hurt. I answered that hiding does not prevent pain, it multiplies it. The only goal left was a clean exit, a path where the children would see two adults choose honesty over theatrics. The front door opened and Erin walked in, Lauren's older sister, her eyes red and sharp with fury. A year earlier, she had lost her fiancé to betrayal, so she knew the shape of devastation. She looked at the binder on the table and her face twisted with recognition. "You don't get to make him your rescuer," she said to her sister. Her arms wrapped around Lauren as though to hold her together, whispering that she would stay with her tonight, that she was safe here, at least from herself. When they finally left, the house collapsed into silence again. I filed the binder into the closet behind a tab I labeled in block letters, "Final." Then I sat with the dog at my feet, staring at the folder as if it were a map to nowhere. I had chosen resolve, not rage. Before dawn, my phone buzzed. A message from Lauren, "Please meet me. Erin's apartment. Noon." I stared at the glow of the screen. The time for improvising had ended. The next conversation would not be about bargaining or begging. It would be about custody, about property, about rules of contact, and about one column with a single title, truth. So I rose, showered, and dressed with the precision of a man preparing for court. The flood had passed, leaving its debris line. Now I would decide what to build and what to burn. By noon, I was at Erin's apartment. The faint smell of chamomile tea tried to soften the air, but no herb could disguise the heaviness of betrayal. The steam curled weakly in the room, powerless against what sat between us. Lauren perched on the edge of the sofa, her hair tied back in a way that made her look younger, or maybe smaller. Erin sat beside her, hands wrapped around a mug she didn't drink. I stayed standing, a yellow legal pad balanced in my hand like a shield. Every word had been written in block letters. There would be no improvisation, no emotional detours, no false hopes. I cleared my throat and began. Custody 50-50, family therapy for the children with individual sessions if needed. No third-party introductions until 6 months after the divorce decree is final. Lauren nodded quickly, too quickly, as though obedience could rewind time. Property equals split. No games. I'll stay in the house until the school year ends so the kids don't lose both space and stability at once. Another nod, her teeth pressing into her lip until it turned white. Contact, logistics only, text or email, no late-night calls, no conversations about the past. This is about co-parenting, not reconciliation. For the first time, she looked directly at me. And truth, she asked. I flipped the page, my voice sharper. Truth, you will report your relationship to HR. It violates company policy, and Adrian, your affair partner's wife, deserves to know. She will hear it from you, or she will hear it from me. Her mug trembled. Aaron reached to steady it before the tea spilled. Lauren whispered, if I do all that, would you at least consider counseling, just to see if something can be saved? No, I said flatly. Confession isn't a coupon. It doesn't buy trust back. The room cracked with silence. Lauren's face collapsed. I can change, she pleaded. I'll prove it, I cut her off. I already went for STI testing. I've also ordered DNA tests for the kids, not for drama, for certainty. The words struck her like a physical blow. She gasped, bent forward, her body folding in on itself. How could you even think? Because you left me no reason not to, I said. If you stood where I stand, would you trust? She covered her face, sobbing into her palms. Erin rubbed her back, but the gesture looked practiced, tired, like she had done it many times before. For nearly 2 hours, the conversation circled the same worn track. Lauren apologizing, me refusing to bend, Erin trying to mediate. Finally, when words had lost their shape and exhaustion outpaced tears, I set my pad down. You are not my problem to solve, I said quietly. I will be kind for the kids, but kindness is not marriage. I turned and walked out before she could answer. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed. A voicemail waited. I pressed play and heard a woman's voice, calm but ragged. This is Adrian. I believe my husband works with your wife. I think we should talk. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands until my knuckles whitened. The truth was no longer mine alone. Tomorrow it would leave the house and enter the world. The voicemail replayed in my mind the entire next day. Adrian's voice carried both restraint and exhaustion, the sound of someone who had been forced to rehearse composure until it became armor. By evening, I agreed to meet her. The restaurant we chose was one of those places designed for discretion, dim lights, dark wood, booths deep enough to hide private wars. I arrived early and chose a corner seat. A server brought water, then vanished like a ghost trained for espionage. When Adrian walked in, she carried herself with the steady exhaustion of someone who knew betrayal too well. She slid into the booth opposite me and placed a folder on the table, crisp and organized, her version of my binder. I wasn't sure how much you knew, she began. Her voice was careful, the cadence of someone terrified of breaking mid-sentence. I pushed my own folder toward her, enough to understand we were both living beside strangers. We opened our evidence like detectives who had never applied for the badge. Adrian's folder contained calendar anomalies, florist receipts signed with unfamiliar initials, dry cleaning tickets that never matched her husband's schedule. She had highlighted entire weeks where Owen claimed late meetings, though the office sat dark. The dates matched my own records almost perfectly. Then Adrian gave me something I had never uncovered, the pattern. This wasn't Owen's first collapse. His first marriage had ended under the shadow of an inappropriate friendship, whispers smothered under confidentiality agreements. A prior HR mediation existed, she said, buried but whispered among colleagues who had learned to look away. Men like him count on silence, Adrian said, her hands clasped tightly on the folder. They bet on their spouses protecting the children from scandal, on coworkers protecting their careers. But silence doesn't erase the damage, it multiplies it. Her words sank into me like slow rain. She urged me to document everything, not to weaponize, but to protect. Divorce twists narratives, she explained. One day your children might hear a version where you're the villain. You'll want records. I nodded and slid across redacted copies of my own file, scrubbed clean of images the children should never see. Adrian accepted them with a solemn gratitude. I'm leaving him, she said simply. There's no negotiation left, but the company, HR, they will spin. Do you want to co-inform them? Strength in numbers. I shook my head. If I walk into HR with you, they'll call it collusion. I can't risk my testimony being dismissed as vengeance. But I tapped my folder. This is my written statement. Use it if you need. My only concern is accuracy. She studied me for a moment, then closed her folder. fair and generous. Silence lingered. The condensation rings on the untouched glasses became our only witnesses. Finally, Adrian spoke again, her words deliberate. The truth costs less now than later. It always collects interest. The sentence struck like a compass needle in my chest. When we rose, the server reappeared, clearing water glasses that had barely been touched. Adrian and I walked out separately, two strangers bound by the same wreckage. Each carried a folder heavier than its paper should allow. Driving home, I felt paradoxically lighter and lonelier. Truth had given me an ally, but allies were not companions. There were no cheers for honesty, no applause for evidence. In stories like ours, the only ovation is silence when the door finally shuts. Sleep abandoned me long before dawn. The meeting with Adrian replayed in my mind, every folder, every line of evidence echoing like static I couldn't turn off. So I gave the static structure. If my mind refused rest, it would at least have order. I pulled out tape, markers, and a stack of paper. By 2 in the morning, the living room wall had become a battlefield of lists, columns that turned grief into categories, pain into spreadsheets. The first heading I scrawled in thick strokes was core principles. Underneath, 4 anchors: dignity, transparency, stability for the kids, no cruelty for sport. I read them aloud like vows. Next came outcomes worth pursuing. Here my handwriting slowed, almost reverent. A decree signed without theatrics. School routines kept intact. A story for the children that did not require them to hate their mother to love their father. I wanted them to look back one day and say, our parents failed each other, but they didn't fail us. Then came the heavy section, practical steps. I scheduled DNA tests, though the thought made my stomach twist. I called the clinic for STI screenings, confirming what I already suspected but needed to know. I made a list of therapists, family, child specialists, even one for myself, though admitting that burned my pride. I drafted a parenting plan with no loopholes, who decided on medical procedures, how holidays would be divided, how travel would be arranged without turning into leverage. Each line was armor against future chaos. On a smaller card, I wrote one word, Elena. I stared at it longer than I expected. Then I turned it face down. She was not an escape hatch, not a substitute for healing. I would not write one betrayal over another, no matter how tempting the shortcut. Beside all this, I taped a sheet titled Temptations. Internet revenge, group chat explosions, midnight explanations that always feel wise until daylight proves otherwise. I circled them in red, a stop sign to myself. Hours passed until the wall resembled a detective's board, arrows, scribbles, underlines. But this was not a hunt for culprits. It was a map forward. At the center, in bold black marker, I wrote the compass that would carry me when guilt tried to disguise itself as mercy. I am not ending a good marriage. Lauren ended it when she made it unshareable. My job now is not to punish, not to gloat, but to build a good life for myself and for our children. I stepped back, studying the chaos I had transformed into order. To anyone else, it would look like desperate paperwork taped in uneven lines. But to me, it was survival. When doubt returned, and it always did, I would come to this wall. I would read until the words became muscle memory, until they held me upright. Finally, I switched off the lamp. The notes glowed faintly in the moonlight like constellations only I could read. They were not answers, not yet, but they were proof that direction was possible. For the first time in months, I felt like I had chosen movement over drift. Monday arrived with the weight of inevitability. Lauren walked into HR carrying a folder heavier than its paper weight. Policy was clear. Any relationship between a supervisor and a direct report demanded disclosure. Any violation demanded investigation. She sat across from the compliance officer, fingers laced too tightly in her lap. Her voice cracked despite rehearsal as she began her statement. By noon, the machinery of procedure engaged. HR required written testimony from both Lauren and Owen Reed. Digital forensics swept through their company-issued devices, emails, calendars, messaging apps. Colleagues who had traveled with them to conferences were summoned, asked about late dinners, unexplained absences, moments when professional blurred into personal. Then something surfaced neither Adrian nor I had anticipated. An anonymous report, logged months earlier by a junior associate. It described Owen's persistent boundary pushing after a conference cocktail hour, too many late-night texts, compliments that bent professionalism, invitations that felt less like mentoring and more like pursuit. The report had not escalated to a formal complaint, but it lived in the HR system like an ember waiting for oxygen. Now it had oxygen. By Wednesday, Lauren had been reassigned to administrative tasks, pending inquiry. Owen was placed on leave. Rumors hissed through the office corridors, half gossip, half schadenfreude. Sympathy for some, eye rolls from others, the kind of theater that proved rules were often treated as stage props. I stayed deliberately at the perimeter. I wasn't the spouse who stormed offices or posted screeds online. I answered HR's questions when required and nothing more. Adrian's attorney sent a preservation letter to Owen's account, warning against the erasure of evidence. The corporate fire spread without my hand on the bellows. At home, I doubled down on the ordinary. Breakfast, school drop-offs, homework, bedtime stories, pasta, garlic, bread, salad, conversations about spelling tests and soccer drills. I built scaffolding around the children's days so they would not feel the tremor of collapsing walls behind them. One evening, after dropping the kids at errands for a sleepover, she stopped me at the door. Her voice was low, deliberate. "You could destroy her reputation completely," she said. "But you've chosen not to, thank you." I shook my head. "Quiet isn't kindness, it's competence. I'm not sharpening knives. I'm keeping the children upright." Still, when I returned to the apartment, I admitted something to myself. Part of me felt warmth at knowing consequences existed at all. The office fire was not revenge, but it was consequence. Gravity had reasserted itself. Lauren and Owen had thought secrecy insulated them. In truth, secrecy only delayed collapse. That night, I poured tea instead of whiskey and sat by the window. The city moved outside, indifferent. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something rarer, relief that the universe hadn't forgotten to tally. The fire burned, and for once I didn't have to fan it. The office fire had burned through procedures and reputations, but at home, the collapse took on a different shape. Lauren sat hunched at Erin's kitchen table, a mug cooling between her hands. Her voice was little more than a whisper. "One more chance, just one more, counseling, conditions, anything. I'll do whatever you want." I kept my arms crossed, not in anger, but to hold myself steady. "Lauren, we've walked this circle too many times. Nothing new is being said. You're not negotiating, you're denying." Her eyes darted desperately, looking for cracks in my resolve. "Give me a month, just a month. You'll see I'm serious. I can change. I already have." Her words cut off when she pressed a hand to her face. A bright line of blood slipped between her fingers. At first, I thought stress had caused a minor rupture, but then the flow became a torrent, sliding down her wrist, staining her sleeve. Erin shot to her feet, fumbling for tissues, panic sharp in her movements. Lauren swayed, her body folding in on itself. I grabbed the car keys without thinking. "We're going, now." The drive to the ER was silent except for Lauren's muffled sobs and Erin's attempts to stem the bleeding. My hand stayed locked on the wheel, steady even as my jaw clenched tight. Sliding doors opened to antiseptic air and fluorescent light. Nurses rushed forward, settling her into a recliner, pressing gauze to her face, monitors beeping in rhythm with her pulse. I sat in a plastic chair, repeating one sentence in my head until it hardened into clarity: compassion is not permission. I could care for her suffering without reopening the marriage. I could sit in this hospital without surrendering my resolve. Hours later, a nurse said she was stable. Exhaustion, stress, insomnia, nothing life-threatening if she rested. When the nurse left, Lauren turned her swollen eyes to me. "I stopped sleeping the night you said divorce. I can't imagine a future without what we had." I leaned forward, calm but unbending. "The future doesn't care what we imagine. It only cares what we do, and what's been done cannot be undone." She turned her face to the wall, silent. Erin rubbed her back, whispering comforts I could not give. Near dawn, I stood. I'll cover your ride home, I told Erin, pressing cash into her palm. Then I texted the pediatrician to reschedule an appointment I'd missed while sitting in that plastic chair. Parenthood logistics, ordinary tasks, they were ballast, weight to keep me from drifting. On the drive back to my apartment, I pulled out my phone at a red light. A draft message to Alina appeared almost by instinct. Rough night. Wish I could hear your voice. My thumb hovered. Then I sighed, deleted it, and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. A near relapse is still relapse. Healing cannot be built on shortcuts. No contact until the papers were signed. That was the promise, and I would keep it. By the time I pulled into the driveway, dawn was brushing the rooftops with pale light. The city moved forward, indifferent but steadier than the night before. I exhaled, heavy but intact. A week after the hospital, desperation returned wearing the mask of productivity. Lauren arrived at my apartment with a thick envelope and set it on the kitchen table. "It's a post-nup," she said, her voice rehearsed but trembling. "Everything in writing. You'd have full financial leverage. I'll sign away property rights, retirement accounts, even the house if you want. My salary can be garnished for child support, whatever it takes." I slid the pages out, scanning the clauses, location-sharing apps, passwords in ink, even the absurd suggestion of weekly polygraphs, rituals no professional would ever agree to. I kept turning the pages until one line caught me. "I will tell the truth even when it hurts me." The only sentence that mattered. Lauren leaned forward, hands locked together like a prayer. "Church, therapy, volunteer work, a year without dating, any ritual you ask for. Just don't erase me completely." I placed the contract back in its envelope. My face was calm, not cruel. "You think these rituals purchase forgiveness? They don't. Truth isn't currency, it's a compass. You lost the map when you tried to buy your way around it." Then I pulled out a single sheet from my folder and slid it across. "Just 3 lines. I accept your confession to HR as necessary, not sufficient. I support family therapy for the children. I will proceed with divorce." She scanned it, then lifted her eyes to mine. "That's it. That's it." Silence thickened until her voice cracked into something raw. "What can I do to regain even 1% of your respect?" I didn't hesitate. "Tell Adrian yourself directly and sign a notarized timeline for the court. No omissions, no edits." The request landed like a stone in still water. She swallowed hard, nodded once, and agreed. By the end of the week, Adrian confirmed the call, halting, stilted, but real. The notarized timeline arrived soon after, seals and signatures pressed into its paper like scars. For the first time since the flood, I felt something brush against closure. Not peace, not forgiveness, simply the end of one argument that had circled too long. That night, as I filed the documents into my binder, the wall of notes no longer looked like chaos. It looked like movement. The ledger was working. Gravity was doing its job. I poured myself a glass of water, sat in the quiet kitchen, and allowed the stillness to remain. Not peace, but enough. The first family therapy session felt like walking into a storm shelter after the funnel cloud had already passed. The walls were calm, the air still, but everyone carried debris inside. I sat at one end of the couch, Lauren at the other. Between us, our children seemed smaller than usual, their shoulders tight, their eyes darting as if they expected the room itself to collapse. The therapist, a woman with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, began with a simple instruction: name the truth without weaponizing it. Her voice was calm but firm. She explained that children deserved clarity, not blame, facts without venom. I nodded, gripping my knees. Lauren nodded too, though her eyes shone with tears she was barely holding back. We followed the script gently. We told the children that Mom and Dad would be living in different houses. We told them that none of this was their fault. We said the love between parents can change, but the love for children does not. But children never stay on script. "Did we cause it?" my daughter whispered. "No," I said firmly. "You caused none of this. You are the reason I get up every day and try to do it right. Don't ever carry weight that isn't yours." My son's question cut even deeper. "Can love die?" I took a breath, steadying my voice. "Love can change shape. Sometimes it shrinks. Sometimes it grows in a new direction. But the love for you, that one never dies. They asked about holidays. Would Christmas still smell like cinnamon rolls? Would birthdays still have balloons? The therapist encouraged them to make a poster of new routines. Together with crayons from a plastic bin, they drew 2 houses, same bedtime. 2 houses, same rules about phones. 2 houses, same parents who still showed up. The poster looked uneven, messy, but it was theirs. Then my son's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Dad, are you going to hate Mom now?" The question landed in my chest like an anchor. I leaned forward, choosing my words carefully. "No, hating her would be too much work, and hate makes you bad at other things you're supposed to love. I won't do that. I won't teach you that." For the first time that afternoon, both children exhaled as if a hidden weight had loosened. On the drive home, my daughter stared out the window for a long while before asking softly, "What does divorce mean to you, Daddy?" My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I thought of ledgers taped to the wall, contracts on the table, hospital nights, and long silences. Then I answered with words I hadn't practiced but knew were true. It means not lying in front of people I love. That night, after the children were asleep, I wrote the therapist a note of thanks. One of her lines had become a lifeline: protect the bond, not the story. I folded the note, slid it into an envelope, and left it on the counter to mail in the morning. Some debts, I realized, could be paid in gratitude. The decree was still pending, but I knew I could not live like the custodian of evidence anymore. My apartment closet had turned into a morgue of paper, screenshots, annotated calendars, timelines cross-referenced as if order could tame chaos. Every night when I opened the door, the binders glared back at me, whispering that my life was still on trial. So one windless evening, I carried them outside. I kept a single copy sealed in the fireproof box, insurance for the court. The rest I stacked beside the grill. The match caught slowly, edges curling before flames found hunger. Paper buckled into ash, ink bled into smoke. I stood with my hands in my pockets, watching not as a man bent on revenge, but as a man marking an ending. The fire was not fury. It was ritual. The boys came out, drawn by the glow. I handed them marshmallows on sticks, the sugar blistering golden above the heat meant for betrayal. Laughter bubbled up, wild and bright, chocolate smearing their cheeks. Against the solemnity of dissolving evidence, their joy felt almost indecent. But it wasn't indecent at all. It was the point. When the flames dwindled to embers, I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo. The grill glowing red, binders collapsed into gray dust. I sent it to Erin with a short caption, "No more archives." Her reply came minutes later. "Good. Closure here was not spectacle. There were no speeches, no vindictive toasts. Just warmth fading into gray and children sticky with sugar who would remember roasted marshmallows, not scorched paper." As I leaned back in my chair, listening to the night settle around us, I realized something simple. The case file was closed, but the story wasn't finished. The next chapters could not be told in bullet points or exhibits. They had to be told with a voice that sounded like living again. The new apartment was small, but its windows refused to let gloom settle. Morning light poured in unapologetically, flooding the walls with warmth I hadn't realized I needed. I had chosen the place for that reason, because light could be stubborn when I wasn't. Still, ghosts moved freely through the rooms. I caught myself setting out 2 mugs, even though only one would ever be used. I reached for a second towel, stepping out of the shower, my hand hovering midair before dropping back. Sometimes in the car, I narrated my day aloud as if Lauren or anyone still sat in the passenger seat. I didn't chase the ghosts away, and I didn't curse them. I named them quietly and let them pass like old neighbors moving through the hallway. They were reminders, not threats. Elena's name hovered in my phone more than once. Twice I nearly pressed call, my thumb lingering over the screen. Twice I set the phone aside. Instead, I wrote a letter I would never send. About timing, about respect, about how one betrayal should not be replaced by another disguised as comfort. The letter stayed folded in my desk drawer, silent but necessary. One Saturday at the grocery store, I saw a father laughing with his ex-wife as their child tried on soccer cleats. Their ease unsettled me. It looked impossible, almost surreal. But in that moment, I understood something essential. Co-parenting did not have to be survival through logistics. It could be a public peace treaty signed every time two parents decided not to let history poison a child's present. So I began offering Lauren small courtesies. Nothing that weakened boundaries, just gestures that cost me little but bought the children air. A reminder about an orthodontist appointment. A text if traffic would delay pickup. Courtesy not as reconciliation, but as architecture. Late one evening, my phone buzzed. Adrian's message was brief. Owen had tried to rewrite the story as mutual confusion, a misunderstanding between two adults. But HR's forensics told a different truth. Thank you, she wrote, for not letting me find out alone. I read her words at the kitchen counter, half a glass of water beside me, the apartment humming with quiet. Solidarity, I realized, was its own form of kindness. Not romance, not revenge. Just the knowledge that someone else had stood in the wreckage and survived the same storm. I set the phone down and looked at the window. My reflection stared back, tired but steady. The light lingered longer than I expected. For once, I let it stay. The inquiry ended with no ambiguity. Owen's termination letter was stamped in black ink, blunt and final. His charm couldn't out-talk policy. Lauren's outcome was softer but still bruising, a formal reprimand, reassignment to a quieter role, and a salary cut that rewrote her household math. The ripples spread quickly. Families chose sides at different volumes. Some whispered sympathy, others judgment. Lauren's mother called me more than once, insisting that a man with real strength would have forgiven her daughter, that by refusing I had dismantled not just a marriage but a family tree. The words landed heavy, but before I could respond, Lauren stepped in. She issued her own statement, measured, unflinching. Her choices were her own, and the consequences were deserved. For once, I did not have to defend myself. Friends circled back into my orbit with sympathetic tones that sounded more like curiosity than care. They prodded gently, like fingers pressing on a scar to see if it still hurt. I gave them polite distance. My world had narrowed to essentials, and ornamental connections had no place in it. Adrian called one evening with a different request. She asked if I could provide a neutral statement for her custody file, just dates and facts, no opinion. She didn't want my interpretation, only confirmation. I agreed. I wrote carefully, stripping the sentences down to clean lines, no adjectives, no color. The truth did not need seasoning. Meanwhile, whispers online tried to catch fire. Posts in group chats, half-truths spun across social networks. I ignored them. Feeding gossip only gave it oxygen, and I had already seen what burned oxygen could do. At the children's school, I passed two parents in the hallway. Their voices dropped to whispers the moment they saw me. I nodded anyway and kept walking. I wasn't pretending indifference, I was practicing it. Consequences spread like dye through water, not in explosions, but in slow saturation. Every drop carried the stain. I saw it in the way people looked at me, at Lauren, at the children. The private had gone public, and there was no pulling it back. One afternoon, waiting in a courthouse corridor for my filings to be processed, I overheard a couple arguing bitterly about who would get custody of their dog. Their desperation twisted their faces, their voices sharp with panic. I watched them for a moment and realized something that startled me. Dignity was a kind of advantage. Even when there was nothing left to win, how you carried yourself was still a choice. When my case was called, I stood straighter. Papers in hand, I walked in with silence as my armor. The envelopes came on an ordinary Tuesday, tucked between grocery flyers and a utility bill. Plain white, sealed, heavier than paper should ever feel. I carried them inside as though they might shatter if I moved too quickly. For an hour, I didn't open them. Instead, I washed the dishes with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. I scrubbed plates until the metal gleamed, rinsed forks until the water ran clear. It wasn't procrastination, it was ritual, a way to steady my hands by pretending the world was still ordinary. Finally, I sat at the table. The first envelope tore open with a sound sharper than it should have been. The words on the page landed like both a prayer answered and a fear dissolved. Both children were mine. Relief hit first, fierce and undeniable, a wave so strong it nearly buckled me in the chair. But relief did not linger. It drained into a bone-deep weariness, the ache of having braced for a sword that never fell. I texted Lauren with stripped, neutral words. Results came in. Both children are mine. Let's keep our conversations practical. Her reply arrived within minutes, gratitude, followed by a promise to fund any future medical testing the kids might ever need. For once, her words felt less like performance and more like responsibility. That evening, I sat with the children at the dinner table. I explained in language chosen carefully, small words with steady weight. "You are exactly who you have always been to me," I told them. My son nodded, my daughter leaned against my arm. The moment closed without questions I wasn't ready to answer. Later, when the house grew quiet and the children were asleep, I stood by the window. My reflection stared back in the glass, weary but lighter. I let myself imagine a phone call I had rehearsed in silence for months. Elena, not as rescue, not as rebound, but as a deliberate choice. When the decree was signed, when the dust of the old life had settled. For the first time in months, the thought didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like possibility. The park looked the same as it always had. Benches carved with initials, maples shedding their leaves in waves of rust and gold. I remembered afternoons when the children dove into leaf piles, their laughter muffled under autumn's weight. Now the air felt thinner, heavy with both history and finality. Lauren was already there when I arrived, a manila folder resting on her lap. She handed it to me without flourish, without bargaining. Inside was the notarized timeline, signed and sealed. No omissions, no edits. Her apology followed, plain and stripped of performance. She wasn't trying to buy anything with it this time. I unfolded my own legal pad, covered with the small questions that always seemed too ordinary for the collapse of a marriage. School pickups, summer camps, medical forms, holiday rotations. We spoke for nearly an hour, sounding less like estranged spouses and more like neighbors negotiating the repair of a shared fence. At one point, her voice wavered, quieter than the breeze. "Is there anything left to salvage?" I looked at her for a long time before answering. "The only thing left to save is the children's sense that the world is survivable when adults tell the truth." She nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "I'll never stop trying to be worth forgiving," she whispered. I breathed slowly, choosing words that landed without cutting. Forgiveness may come one day, but it won't mean reconciliation. We stood then, two people at the ragged edge of a map we had once drawn together, its borders now torn and rewritten. I thanked her for the years that had been good, for mornings that had been real even if they couldn't last. She thanked me back for refusing to turn the ending into spectacle, for holding to dignity when it would have been easier to scorch the ground. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't absolution. It was simply humane. When we finally walked away, we moved in opposite directions, but at the same pace, like two halves of a story that no longer needed to meet again. The decree arrived on an unremarkable Thursday, delivered in a plain envelope that looked no different from a utility bill. But inside, its weight was heavier than all the binders of evidence I had ever kept. I read it once, twice, then tucked one certified copy into the fireproof box and filed the rest away. Not as trophies, not as relics, simply as records. The paper had spoken the final word. The living could now move on. Routines held steady, like scaffolding made of ordinary joy. Pancakes on Saturdays, my boys arguing over chocolate chips. Library trips on Sundays, my daughter stacking books higher than her arms could carry. Bedtime stories no longer rushed. I lingered over them, listening to the rhythm of their breathing as they drifted into sleep. I painted the apartment walls a color called harbor. Only after the rollers dried did I understand why. I had wanted a place that felt like safety, like anchoring without imprisonment. The light that poured through the stubborn windows no longer fell on ghosts, it fell on us. After a respectful stretch of months, I dialed Elena. The call was not tentative, not reckless. We talked for an hour, laughter slipping in naturally, not forced. Two adults with dents not auditioning for instant couplehood, simply relieved to find someone whose voice lightened the day. To my children, I gave one sentence that became a compass. Happiness doesn't mean forgetting. It means not letting pain be the only narrator. They absorbed it quietly. Later that week, I overheard my son repeating it to his sister when she cried at bedtime. That echo was worth more than any decree. With Lauren, co-parenting settled into rhythm. The shared calendar became a neutral tool, stripped of barbs. Drop-offs were brief but steady, holidays managed without courtroom theatrics. Erin invited us both to her daughter's birthday. At first the smiles were stiff, but by the end of cake and candles, most of them were real. Weeks later, I returned to the old house to collect a forgotten box of winter boots. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it, the place where the siren of betrayal had first sounded. For a moment, memory pressed hard against me. Then I reached into the cabinet, rinsed a single mug, and set it upside down on the rack. No performance, no symbolism, just closure in its simplest form. I turned off the light and closed the door without flinching. The story did not end in triumph or ruin. It ended with a man choosing his future, deliberately, quietly, and on purpose. What would you do if the person you trusted most destroyed your family from within? This is not just a story about betrayal. It's about the painful choice between staying in a broken marriage or walking away to save yourself and your children. In today's video on Cheating Stories 7, you'll hear how one man uncovered his wife's long-hidden affair and realized that divorce was not revenge. It was survival. Stay until the end, because the twist will leave you questioning what you would do in his place. So, let's dive into this gripping story. My wife's affair shattered our family. Divorce was my only choice.